Because we want to get to a stage where we can get rid of all the masking fluid and pencil, I'm just going to mix up the colour for the soft little bedding bit behind the beans. It's a sort of greyish green, so we'll just go with the green that we've got mixed up and add a little bit more cadmium red. And just a little bit of French ultramarine. This should darken it a little bit and also make it a little bit greyer. We've got the other colours on the palette, so we can use those to drop in while it's still wet. So first thing is to put a nice simple glaze over the area that we're going to paint. Be very careful to go right around the little beans so that you don't overlap the washes. And bring that water right the way down to the bottom. Give the colour that you've just made a little stir. I'm just going to sweep that down from the top, being very careful not to overlap with the edge or around the bean. I've got the brighter green that I mixed up for the lower parts, and I'm going to just drop that in at the same time. Quite nice to have these other colours that you can mix and match as you go down. So brighter green through here. Very careful around there, and pick up the grey. You don't even need to wash your brush in between time because all the colours are going to soften together. Sweeping all the way down to the bottom, and you can see how the masking fluid is pushing the paint away down here. Right, now clean your brush, take all the water out of it, and in the lighter areas where you can see the light's really hitting quite strong, you can hoover out the body of the colour with a clean damp brush. You want to clean your brush intermittently so that you don't put on what you've just lifted off. Sweep the brush down. The lighter areas, just hoover that paint away. If there's any colours that you think need brightening up, you can still drop in a little bit of the brighter green. That's all masked out, so that's not too bad around there, but I'll just run the brush over just to mush everything together. I'm going to just add a little bit of brighter green just at the top there to give that a little bit more interest up there, and also make it look a little more closed in. That's the original green that we use for the back of the pod. And put a little bit towards the edge there, and then soften it in. Just use my finger there to push the glaze back, but whatever works. And sweep the brush underneath that. And when you're happy with the amount of colour that you've got on there, just sit back a little bit, have a little overall look at the painting. And say, when you're happy with the level of paint you've got on there, you just let it dry. Okay, now I've rubbed out the pencil and got rid of the masking fluid. You can see the little bits of detail that I've managed to retain. And we're going to now add a little bit more substance to the beans. So I'm going to take another little bit of my paint from the reservoir. I'm going to add a little bit more cadmium red deep. That immediately turns it brown. A little bit more of the French ultramarine, and water that down. This is more like a sort of shadowy green colour, just to give them a little bit more shape. I'm going to glaze the area with some clean water. Be very careful now that you're not going over the edges. Just very gently create the shape in water. Hoover up the excess water so it's not too wet. You want it to look a little bit like orange peel when you look at it in the light. Pick up a very small amount of that colour, give your brush a little twist, and just put it where you can see the shadow. I'm just gently dabbing it on, very lightly, just to create some shape. Quite strong shadows on the underneath here. A little bit stronger. You can keep dropping it in. Just watch how far it spreads. It should have a nice soft edge to it so it looks nice and gentle. When you're happy with that level of shadow, you can map in the other ones as well. So while those beans are drying, we're going to use the same colour but with a dry brush method, where there's a little bit of paint on the brush and we flatten the brush out to put in some texture around them. So the same colour, I'm just going to flatten the brush against the palette. And there's hardly any water on the brush and very little water on the paint, so hopefully it'll make a nice little dry mark on the paper. And I'm going to use it in a sort of feathery motion to sort of help with this texture that's on the inside here. So I'm breaking through the little marks left by the masking fluid and just gently sketching that in. And I'll continue to do this throughout the whole of this pod. I'm now going to change that dry brushing to a brighter green, and I'm going to use the same green that I've made up in the little pot, but add a little bit of lemon to that, and just dry brush in a couple more areas to get a little bit more light shining through. So flattening the brush and just very gently sweeping it on as though you were dusting fairy wings, very, very light. And I'm just going to continue down the pod around all the other beans. I'm just going to add a little bit more green to the beans as well, just to liven them up a bit. And I'll just put this on in very gentle, small amounts, just with the tip of the brush, where you think it needs to go a little bit brighter and a little bit more shadow as well. So I put some of that colour on and just soften that in with a damp brush. Okay, and we'll just leave that to dry. We're now ready to put a little bit more colour and texture onto the outside of the pod, so let's start with that colour that I've already got mixed up. A nice big puddle of that. And I'm going to use this almost like dry brush technique, so I'm going to take some of the colour and just keep flattening it out with the brush on the palette. And then I'm going to very gently brush some texture onto the top of the pod. What I'll do is I'll work the pod up with some nice little bits of strong green texture, and then I'll put a finishing glaze over the top. So I'll work this little area up here and then continue down the pod. Try and change the angle of the brush here and there just to get a little bit more movement into it, but also bear in mind the shape that you're trying to create, so don't obliterate your highlights. As I move further into the pod, I'm just going to lighten the colour a little bit and add a little bit more cadmium yellow pale. So I'll just work my way down the pod now. We don't need to let that dry, we can just put a glaze right over the top so long as we wet the highlights so that we don't lose those. So I'm just going to put a little glaze over the bright side of the pod and then stir up the colour. I'm going to use the colour that I mixed in the little pot so it's nice and bright. Get it really nice and fluid, and then glaze over the top of your dry brushing. It'll disturb a little bit of it, but not too much. You'll still have the texture shining through. Just be careful not to get any hard edges anywhere. So pull the colour all the way down in one go, and then use the brush to soften the edge. And obviously we wet the highlights, so that should soften into those quite nicely. Just going to add a little bit of cadmium red deep as well into that, just to make it a little bit browner. And come down the other side. This is where you need to be very careful because we've got to get a nice sharp outline to the pod. Just do about half of that because there's quite a long way to go on that. And then soften that into the highlights. And then continue down. And soften in. You can move that paint around just to blend in any little areas that you think aren't gentle enough. Now that's dry, I'm going to add a little bit more green just to define a bit more shape on the pod. I'm going to use that green that I mixed a little bit of cadmium red into and just put it where I need it basically. If you get this quite nice and wet, you can just break into that highlight a little bit more and then soften around that edge with a damp brush just to mush it all in. It's always a good idea to retain the highlights as long as you can, and then you can remove the ones you don't need right towards the end. Just a little bit more at the bottom here, just to break into those little highlights down here. Put it on quite loosely because it's only a soft glaze, and then just soften around. Keep an eye on those as they're drying because sometimes you can get a little watermark around them and you can just quickly sweep that away before it settles. So while that's all settling, I'll continue with the brighter green and map in some of the top of the pod up here in between all the twiddly bits. Just a nice little dash of green up there. And now I'm going to mix a slightly more shadowy colour. I'm going to take a little bit of the green, add a lot more French ultramarine, and add a little bit of cadmium red deep. So I've got a nice shadowy green. And I'm going to be very careful and just have a little look at the pod and see where the shadows should go. So I'm going to go a little bit stronger on this side of the pod. Again, just put on a little at a time, and that way you don't lose control. A little bit darker there. I've got some lovely strong shadows across the beans. A little bit darker in here. Take a little bit more colour out of that there. All the little details will shine through. This is only a very gentle glaze. You don't need to soften the edge across the side of the bean because it's quite a strong shadow across the beans. So just a nice even sweep across those. A little bit more shadow through here and across the bottom of this little baby bean. Once you're happy with that, I'm going to mix up a stronger green, add quite a lot of cadmium red deep to it, and the French ultramarine, same colours again but make it much darker. Be quite robust with it so that it doesn't fade to nothing when it dries. And now we can map in these little twiddly bits of dry bean at the top. It's quite nice to be a little bit sweepy with these, really use the brush to create some lovely little poetic lines here. Just going to map them in quite quickly. Some very fine little strands here, and I'm just going to use the very tip of a number 4 brush and just sweep it away. And then it's all very knotty and tangly here, so I'm going to let the brush dance across a bit and look at all the little marks as I'm doing that. What I shall do is continue down the bean and put in all the little blemishes along the edges. Okay, so there we have it, our finished broad bean portrait.
Now available to buy. Try these techniques at home whenever you wish. The DVD of today's workshop and the book that accompanies this series are now available to order from the Painting and Drawing channel. For further information and to order your copy, go to www.paintingdrawingchannel.com.